The early morning mist clung to the steel decks of the carrier Tsukuyomi as Admiral Akira Hayakawa stood rigidly before the intelligence briefing that would determine her nation's destiny. It was May 28, 1942, and the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War was just 7 days away. What Hayakawa didn't realize was that her empire had already signed its own death warrant the moment she dismissed the report lying before her on the conference table of the flagship that had never known defeat. For 8 months, the Imperial Navy's first striking force had carved through the Pacific like an unstoppable typhoon, leaving shattered enemy fleets and burning harbors in its wake. Under Admiral Hayakawa's brilliant tactical command, the carriers Tsukuyomi, Raijin, Susanoo, and Amaterasu had delivered crushing defeats that echoed across the world. Pearl Harbor reduced to smoking ruins, Wake Island's garrison annihilated, the Dutch East Indies swept clean of Allied resistance. The success had been nothing short of miraculous. Admiral Hayakawa herself had become the most celebrated naval commander in Japanese history, the iron-willed strategist who had brought the mighty American Pacific Fleet to its knees in a single devastating morning. Her pilots, veterans of countless victories, were the elite of Japanese naval aviation, men who had flown through hell and emerged victorious every single time. The 4 fleet carriers under her command represented the pinnacle of naval engineering and tactical innovation. The Tsukuyomi, her flagship, displaced 42,000 tons and could launch 84 aircraft in perfect coordinated waves. The Raijin and Susanoo, sister ships of deadly efficiency, had perfected the art of simultaneous multi-axis attacks that no enemy had yet survived. The newest addition, Amaterasu, boasted the most advanced radar and communication systems in the Pacific. But perhaps more intoxicating than the ships themselves was the psychological transformation that victory had wrought. The Japanese Naval Command had evolved from cautious tacticians into supreme strategists who believed themselves incapable of error. Every battle plan had been executed flawlessly. Every enemy formation had been scattered or destroyed. Every prediction about American weakness had been proven correct. Admiral Hayakawa embodied this dangerous confidence. At 47, she was the youngest fleet admiral in Japanese history, her rise meteoric and seemingly unstoppable. Her tactical genius had been proven in 8 separate engagements without a single defeat. Her understanding of carrier aviation was unmatched. Her ability to coordinate complex multi-carrier operations had revolutionized naval warfare itself. Success, however, had bred something far more dangerous than complacency. It had created absolute certainty. The Imperial Navy's command structure, built on rigid hierarchy and unquestioning loyalty, had transformed tactical brilliance into strategic blindness. When subordinates brought uncomfortable intelligence, their reports were questioned. When reconnaissance detected troubling enemy movements, the findings were dismissed as misinterpretation or enemy deception. Commander Yuki Nakamura, Admiral Hayakawa's chief intelligence officer and one of the few women in senior naval command, had been tracking increasingly disturbing patterns for the past month. A graduate of the Imperial Naval Academy's intelligence program, Nakamura possessed an analytical mind that could detect patterns others missed and the courage to present uncomfortable truths to superior officers. American radio traffic had undergone a dramatic transformation in recent weeks. Instead of scattered, defensive communications they had intercepted for months, enemy transmissions now showed coordination and purpose. Submarine patrols reported unusual fleet concentrations near the Hawaiian Islands, not the random defensive positioning of a broken navy, but the deliberate maneuvering of forces preparing for offensive action. Most troubling of all, Japanese reconnaissance flights were being intercepted with suspicious frequency and precision. Enemy fighters appeared exactly where and when they were needed, as if American commanders possessed perfect intelligence about Japanese patrol routes and timing. This suggested either impossible luck or a level of intelligence capability that Japanese planners had dismissed as beyond American abilities. Admiral, Commander Nakamura began carefully during the dawn intelligence briefing aboard the flagship Tsukuyomi, her voice steadied despite the magnitude of what she was about to suggest. "Our comprehensive analysis indicates the Americans may possess detailed knowledge of Operation Thunderstrike." The silence in the briefing room was absolute. Operation Thunderstrike represented the culmination of Japanese strategic planning, a massive coordinated assault designed to capture the strategic atoll of Coral Reef, draw out the remaining American carriers, and destroy them in one climactic engagement that would force the United States to negotiate peace terms favorable to Japan. Admiral Hayakawa studied her intelligence chief with the intense gaze that had intimidated subordinates throughout her career. "Explain your reasoning, Commander." Nakamura had prepared for this moment, knowing that challenging her admiral's assumptions required irrefutable evidence. "Ma'am, we've identified 17 separate indicators suggesting advanced American intelligence capabilities. Their submarine positioning shows knowledge of our approach routes. Radio intercepts indicate they're tracking our fleet movements with impossible accuracy. Most significantly, their fighter patrol patterns suggest they know our reconnaissance schedules better than some of our own pilots." Lieutenant Commander Keiko Sato, the fleet's signals intelligence coordinator, supported her colleague with additional evidence. "Admiral, we've detected coordinated American fleet movements that correspond precisely to our own operational timeline. 3 separate carrier task forces are positioning themselves along our projected approach vectors to Coral Reef. Captain Mari Ishida of the carrier Susanoo, another of the few female officers in the fleet's senior command, had noticed troubling tactical developments during recent engagements. Ma'am, American fighter tactics have evolved significantly. Their pilots are anticipating our standard attack formations and positioning their defenses accordingly. This suggests detailed study of our operational methods." Admiral Hayakawa's expression hardened with each presentation of contrary evidence. The suggestion that American intelligence capabilities exceeded Japanese estimates challenged not only the current operation, but the fundamental assumptions underlying Japan's Pacific strategy. "Impossible," she declared, her voice carrying the absolute authority of unchallenged success. "Our naval cipher systems are mathematically unbreakable. American cryptographic capabilities are primitive compared to our own. The enemy transmissions you're interpreting as coordination are the desperate communications of a scattered, demoralized fleet attempting to maintain defensive positions." Commander Nakamura persisted, despite the dangerous territory she was entering. "Admiral, with respect, the mathematical patterns in enemy fleet movements cannot be explained by defensive positioning. These are offensive formations designed for coordinated attack." "Enough!" Admiral Hayakawa's voice echoed through the steel-walled briefing room with finality. "I will not permit defeatist analysis to undermine operational confidence. The Americans are broken. Pearl Harbor shattered their naval strength and their fighting spirit. They flee from contact with our forces and hide behind defensive barriers. Our victory at Coral Reef will complete the destruction we began 8 months ago." What none of the officers present fully understood was that Captain Reika Tanaka of the carrier Amaterasu watched these exchanges with growing apprehension. Unlike most of her colleagues, Tanaka had served as a naval attaché in Washington before the war, where she had developed a deep appreciation for American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and the peculiar determination that emerged when Americans believed they were fighting for survival. The intelligence reports that Commander Nakamura presented weren't speculation or enemy propaganda. They represented a fundamental shift in the balance of naval intelligence that Japanese commanders were psychologically incapable of acknowledging. 4,000 miles away from the Japanese fleet's position, in a heavily fortified basement complex beneath Pearl Harbor's Naval Intelligence Center, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell hunched over her desk surrounded by towering stacks of decoded Japanese transmissions. The basement facility, known only as Station Hypo, represented America's most closely guarded secret and potentially its most powerful weapon in the Pacific War. The fluorescent lights hummed continuously as teams of cryptographers worked in shifts around the clock, their modified typewriters clicking steadily as they transformed intercepted enemy communications into actionable intelligence. What they had achieved would have been considered impossible by Japanese naval planners: complete penetration of the Imperial Navy's most secure communication systems. The breakthrough had occurred gradually over many months of painstaking analysis. Japanese naval cipher JN-25, considered unbreakable by its creators, had been systematically dismantled by American cryptographers using techniques that combined mathematical analysis with intuitive pattern recognition. Every Japanese transmission, operational orders, tactical discussions, logistical planning, even personal communications between officers, was being intercepted, decoded, and analyzed in real time. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, a former mathematics professor who had been recruited specifically for her analytical capabilities, had been tracking Japanese fleet movements with increasing excitement. The intelligence picture emerging from decoded transmissions was unprecedented in its detail and strategic value. "Admiral King needs to see this analysis immediately," Mitchell told her assistant, Lieutenant Jennifer Chen, as she compiled the final assessment of Japanese intentions. The intelligence painted a crystal-clear picture of enemy plans, but convincing skeptical fleet commanders would require presentation that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. The operation Japanese planners called Thunderstrike was audacious in its scope and potentially decisive in its implications. Admiral Hayakawa intended to deploy virtually her entire striking force in a complex, multi-pronged assault designed to capture Coral Reef and eliminate remaining American carrier strength in a single, coordinated battle. But what the Japanese didn't realize was that American intelligence possessed something more valuable than numerical superiority or technological advantage: complete and detailed knowledge of enemy intentions, capabilities, and operational planning. Commander Patricia Reynolds, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence coordinator, studied the decoded Japanese transmissions with growing strategic understanding. The enemy plan revealed not only their tactical objectives, but the psychological assumptions underlying their strategic thinking. Japanese commanders clearly believed American naval forces remained scattered, demoralized, and incapable of coordinated resistance. This fundamental misassessment of American capabilities and resolve would prove fatal to Japanese hopes of victory. The decoded intelligence revealed Japanese timeline with startling precision. The carrier striking force under Admiral Hayakawa would approach Coral Reef from the northwest on June 4, 1942. They planned to launch their initial attack at dawn, expecting to encounter minimal organized resistance from American forces they believed were thousands of miles away, undergoing repairs and reorganization. What they wouldn't expect was 3 fully operational American carrier task forces positioned northeast of Coral Reef in carefully chosen ambush positions, ready to catch the Japanese fleet at its most vulnerable moment during aircraft recovery operations. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Elizabeth Harper with carriers Enterprise and Wasp, would provide the primary striking power. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Catherine Bradley with the carrier Yorktown, would deliver coordinated follow-up attacks. Task Force 18, led by Rear Admiral Michelle Summers with the carrier Lexington, would serve as reserve force and provide additional flexibility. Together, these forces would deploy 147 aircraft against the Japanese formation's 284, but they possessed the decisive advantages of surprise, optimal positioning, and complete knowledge of enemy intentions, timing, and tactical planning. The contrast between American and Japanese intelligence operations couldn't have been more dramatic. While Japanese commanders dismissed intelligence and challenged their preconceptions, American officers embraced information that forced them to reconsider assumptions and adapt their strategies accordingly. The fundamental difference between American and Japanese command cultures extended far beyond mere organizational preferences. It represented completely different approaches to information processing, decision-making, and strategic adaptation that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Pacific War. Japanese naval culture, built upon centuries of tradition emphasizing honor, hierarchy, and absolute loyalty to superior officers, created an environment where questioning senior commanders' strategic assumptions was considered not merely insubordinate but fundamentally dishonorable. This cultural framework, which had served Japanese society effectively in many contexts, proved catastrophically unsuited to the demands of modern intelligence-based warfare. Admiral Hayakawa embodied both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of this system. Her tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership had generated 8 months of unprecedented naval victories. Her ability to coordinate complex multi-carrier operations had revolutionized Pacific warfare. Her strategic vision had brought Japan closer to total victory than any military leader in the nation's history. But success had transformed her from a tactically flexible commander into a strategically rigid leader who interpreted challenges to her assumptions as personal attacks on her competence and honor. The suggestion that American intelligence capabilities might exceed Japanese estimates wasn't merely wrong, it was insulting to contemplate. This psychological transformation affected the entire Japanese command structure. Squadron commanders who observed unusual American response patterns kept their concerns private rather than risk appearing to question superior officers' assessments. Pilots who reported increasingly sophisticated enemy tactics were told they were overestimating American capabilities. Intelligence officers who attempted to synthesize troubling indicators found their analyses dismissed as defeatist speculation. The Japanese had created what modern analysts would recognize as a classic confirmation bias feedback loop. Information that supported existing assumptions was welcomed and amplified. Intelligence that challenged prevailing wisdom was questioned, minimized, or ignored entirely. The result was a command structure that became progressively more disconnected from battlefield realities, even as those realities shifted decisively against Japanese interests. Commander Nakamura understood this dynamic better than most of her colleagues, having studied American naval culture during her pre-war intelligence training. She recognized that Japanese commanders were making strategic decisions based on outdated assumptions about American capabilities, resolve, and strategic planning. But the cultural and hierarchical barriers to effective communication of uncomfortable truths made it nearly impossible to correct these dangerous misconceptions. Meanwhile, American commanders operated within a fundamentally different cultural framework that actively encouraged subordinates to challenge assumptions, present contrary evidence, and engage in the kind of critical analysis that Japanese culture discouraged. This wasn't merely a matter of democratic versus authoritarian leadership styles. It represented completely different approaches to information processing and strategic adaptation. British psychological implications extended beyond mere organizational differences. Japanese commanders had become prisoners of their own success, unable to imagine that their previous victories might have been achieved against an enemy that was learning, adapting, and preparing for decisive counteraction. American commanders, sobered by early defeats and forced to confront their own limitations, had developed a more realistic assessment of both enemy capabilities and their own strategic requirements. As May transitioned into June 1942, two massive naval forces began their final approach toward what would become the most decisive confrontation in Pacific War history. The psychological and intelligence dynamics that had been developing for months were about to collide with devastating consequences for the side that had chosen institutional blindness over uncomfortable truth. Admiral Hayakawa's striking force represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power and tactical coordination. The 4 fleet carriers steaming northwest toward Coral Reef carried the most experienced pilots in the world, flying the most advanced aircraft in their respective categories. The escort vessels, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were commanded by officers whose tactical skills had been proven in multiple successful engagements. But this formidable force was approaching battle under fundamental strategic misconceptions that would prove fatal. Japanese intelligence estimates suggested minimal American naval presence in the coral reef area. Reconnaissance reports indicated scattered defensive positions rather than coordinated fleet concentrations. Most critically, Japanese commanders remained convinced that American code-breaking capabilities were primitive and that their own operational security remained intact. The reality was starkly different. Every Japanese transmission had been intercepted and decoded. Every operational order had been analyzed and disseminated to American fleet commanders. Every tactical intention had been anticipated and countered through careful positioning and coordinated planning. American carriers were already in position northeast of Coral Reef, their aircraft armed with specialized anti-ship weapons, and their pilots briefed on detailed attack plans based on complete knowledge of enemy fleet composition, approach routes, and tactical preferences. The hunters had become the hunted, though only one side understood the true nature of the approaching engagement. Commander Nakamura made one final attempt to warn her admiral about the mounting intelligence indicators suggesting American preparedness. The evidence had become overwhelming. Coordinated enemy fleet movements, sophisticated tactical responses, communication patterns indicating high-level strategic planning rather than desperate defensive improvisation. "Admiral," she began during the final pre-battle intelligence briefing, "I must respectfully request reconsideration of our tactical assumptions regarding American fleet disposition and capabilities." Admiral Hayakawa's response was swift and final. "Commander, your concerns have been noted and evaluated. American naval forces remain scattered and demoralized following our previous victories. Intelligence suggesting otherwise represents either enemy deception or misinterpretation of defensive positioning. Operation Thunderstrike will proceed as planned." What neither commander nor intelligence officer realized was that their conversation was being monitored by American cryptographers, who had successfully penetrated Japanese ship-to-ship communication systems. Every tactical discussion, every strategic assumption, every operational detail was being transmitted directly to Admiral Nimitz's command center at Pearl Harbor. The stage was set for a confrontation that would validate or destroy the strategic assumptions that had guided both sides for 8 months of Pacific warfare. Japanese confidence in their tactical superiority and American weakness was about to meet American preparation based on complete intelligence penetration and careful strategic planning. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, Admiral Hayakawa stood on the bridge of the Tsukuyomi, confident that she was about to deliver the decisive blow that would secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific and force American acceptance of a negotiated peace favorable to Japanese war aims. She had no way of knowing that American dive bombers were already being armed with armor-piercing bombs specifically designed to penetrate carrier flight decks. Enemy pilots had spent weeks studying recognition photographs of her ships, memorizing their silhouettes and defensive characteristics. Task force commanders had positioned their fleets with mathematical precision based on decoded Japanese operational plans, ready to execute the most devastating ambush in naval warfare history. The warnings had been there all along, ignored by commanders who preferred comfortable assumptions to uncomfortable realities. The intelligence failures were mounting, dismissed by leaders who equated strategic flexibility with personal weakness. The enemy was prepared, positioned, and waiting with complete knowledge of Japanese intentions and capabilities. But Admiral Hayakawa sailed toward the dawn of June 4, 1942, still believing her fleet was invincible and her enemies were broken.
She was about to discover that in modern warfare, the side that sees clearly will always defeat the side that chooses blindness, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. The trap was set with mathematical precision. The hunted had become the hunters through superior intelligence and strategic preparation. Japan's most celebrated admiral was about to learn that institutional arrogance is more dangerous than any enemy weapon.
British. Next time, witness the moment 8 months of Japanese naval supremacy crumbled in 8 minutes of devastating American attack, and discover how the most catastrophic intelligence failure in military history unfolded in real time as pride met preparation and overconfidence confronted reality. The morning sun was rising over the Pacific, and with it would come the reckoning that Japanese admirals had made inevitable through their refusal to acknowledge what their own intelligence officers had been trying to tell them for months. Victory had made them blind. Now they would pay the price for that blindness with their empire, their fleet, and ultimately, their war. The warnings had been ignored, the intelligence dismissed. The trap was set. Now, as dawn broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, Admiral Akira Hayakawa's mighty striking force approached Coral Reef with supreme confidence, unaware that every move had been anticipated, every plan decoded, every assumption about to be shattered in the most devastating 8 minutes in naval warfare history. What happened next would not only decide the Battle of Coral Reef, it would determine the fate of the Pacific War and prove that institutional arrogance could destroy even the mightiest empire. The pre-dawn hours of June 4th brought crystalline skies over the Central Pacific, perfect conditions for the aerial warfare that would soon unfold. Aboard the Japanese flagship Tsukuyomi, Admiral Hayakawa reviewed the morning's operational plans one final time, her confidence absolute after 8 months of unbroken victory. At 04:45 hours, the first wave launched from all 4 Japanese carriers in a thunderous display of coordinated precision that had become the signature of Japanese naval supremacy. Commander Yuki Matsumoto led 126 aircraft toward Coral Reef, 45 Aichi dive bombers, 45 Nakajima horizontal bombers, and 36 Zero fighters, creating a mechanical symphony that had terrorized the Pacific for nearly a year. The formation was flawless. The pilots, veteran warriors who had never known defeat. What Matsumoto didn't realize was that American radar operators on Coral Reef had detected her formation at 180 miles out, providing crucial warning time that would prove decisive in the coming battle. But the Japanese had made their first critical error of the day. Admiral Hayakawa had authorized only 9 reconnaissance aircraft to search the vast ocean northeast of their position, the exact sector where 3 American carrier task forces lay waiting in carefully prepared ambush positions. This decision, made to maximize the striking power of the Coral Reef attack, would prove catastrophically insufficient. Worse still, the crucial reconnaissance seaplane from the cruiser Takao was delayed by 45 minutes due to mechanical problems that maintenance crews struggled to resolve. This delay created a blind spot in Japanese intelligence that would prove fatal, leaving an entire sector of ocean unsearched precisely when American carriers were maneuvering into optimal attack positions. Captain Reika Tanaka, observing from the bridge of the carrier Amaterasu, felt a growing sense of unease as she watched the morning's operations unfold. Her experience as a naval attaché in Washington had taught her to respect American technical capabilities and industrial capacity. The intelligence warnings that Commander Nakamura had presented over the past weeks suddenly seemed less like defeatist speculation and more like uncomfortable truth. On Coral Reef itself, every available aircraft was being launched to meet the approaching Japanese threat. Marine Fighter Squadron 237, flying obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, climbed desperately toward the incoming formation. They were joined by Army Air Force B-26 bombers and a detachment of Navy torpedo bombers, a collection of aircraft that represented American determination rather than American strength. The air battle over Coral Reef was brief and devastatingly one-sided. Japanese Zero fighters tore through the American formations with the precision that had made them masters of Pacific skies. Of 32 Marine fighters that engaged, only 11 returned to base, most heavily damaged. The American pilots fought with desperate courage, but their equipment was no match for superior Japanese aircraft and the world's most experienced naval aviators. Commander Matsumoto's bombers plastered coral reef's installations with devastating accuracy, destroying fuel depots, aircraft hangars, and defensive positions. However, the airfield remained operational, and American aircraft continued launching from the cratered runways, a resiliency that would force a crucial decision that would doom the Japanese fleet. At 7:15 hours, Matsumoto radioed back to Admiral Hayakawa with the message that sealed Japan's fate: second attack necessary to neutralize remaining enemy air capability. This transmission triggered a series of decisions that violated every principle of carrier warfare doctrine. Admiral Hayakawa, determined to complete the destruction of Coral Reef before dealing with any potential naval threats, ordered her reserve aircraft, originally armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship operations, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for land attack missions. What Admiral Hayakawa didn't know was that her fleet was already under observation by American reconnaissance aircraft that had found them through precise navigation based on decoded Japanese transmissions. At 7:30 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Sweeney's B-17 Flying Fortresses from Coral Reef located the Japanese carriers and began high-altitude bombing runs that, while causing no damage, provided exact position reports to Admiral Harper on board the Enterprise.
British. The critical moment arrived at 07:58 hours when the delayed reconnaissance aircraft from the cruiser Takao finally reached its search area and made the discovery that changed everything. Enemy ships sighted, 10 vessels bearing 015 degrees, distance 250 miles. The pilot had found Task Force 16, and the intelligence failure that Japanese admirals had dismissed for weeks was suddenly, catastrophically real. American carriers were not safely harbored at Pearl Harbor or scattered across the Pacific in defensive positions. They were within striking distance, positioned to exploit Japanese vulnerabilities with mathematical precision. Commander Nakamura rushed to Admiral Hayakawa with the scout plane's report, her face pale with the implications of what American presence meant for their operational assumptions. The Admiral stared at the message in stunned disbelief, her mind racing through tactical possibilities that had never been considered in their operational planning. "Are there carriers in the enemy formation?" Hayakawa demanded, though she already knew the answer would determine whether the next hour brought victory or catastrophe. At 08:20 hours, the Takao scout plane confirmed Japanese fears with a transmission that shattered 8 months of strategic certainty. Enemy force includes what appears to be carrier with aircraft on deck. The message from the reconnaissance aircraft hit Admiral Hayakawa's command center like a thunderbolt. After months of dismissing intelligence warnings about American fleet movements, the Japanese were confronted with undeniable proof that enemy carriers were not only operational, but positioned for immediate attack. Commander Nakamura burst into the Admiral's Combat Information Center, her usual composed demeanor shattered by the implications of the scout plane's report. "Admiral, we must launch immediately against the American carriers. Every minute of delay increases their tactical advantage." Hayakawa understood better than anyone the devastating potential of coordinated carrier strikes. She had perfected the technique that brought America to its knees at Pearl Harbor. Now she could see that same tactical innovation being turned against her own fleet with potentially catastrophic results. The Admiral faced an impossible choice that would define not only the battle, but the entire Pacific War. Half her aircraft were returning from the Coral Reef strike, running low on fuel and ammunition after the morning's combat. Her reserve aircraft were in the middle of being rearmed from anti-ship to land attack weapons for the planned second strike against the atoll. The flight decks of all 4 carriers were cluttered with aircraft, ordnance, fuel lines, and maintenance equipment, a logistical nightmare for any carrier commander attempting rapid tactical adaptation. "How long until the Coral Reef strike force returns?" Hayakawa asked her operations officer, Captain Miki Yoshida, already knowing the answer would complicate every option available. 35 minutes, Admiral. Several aircraft are damaged and all are critically low on fuel. We must recover them before launching any additional operations." The fundamental dilemma was clear and brutal.
Admiral Hayakawa could launch an immediate attack with whatever aircraft were available, but this would mean abandoning her returning pilots to crash into the ocean when their fuel ran out. Alternatively, she could wait to recover the Coral Reef Strike Force, properly rearm her aircraft, and launch a coordinated assault on the American carriers. It was a decision based on sound tactical principles and humanitarian concern for her pilots, but it ignored the fundamental reality that she was no longer fighting a surprised, unprepared enemy. What Admiral Hayakawa didn't know was that American dive bombers were already airborne and approaching her position based on precise coordinates provided by reconnaissance aircraft and confirmed by decoded Japanese transmissions. At 06:06 hours, Lieutenant Commander Rebecca McCluskey had launched from the Enterprise with 42 Dauntless dive bombers. At 07:52 hours, Lieutenant Commander Diana Leslie took off from the Yorktown with 19 more Dauntless dive bombers. The Americans were executing the coordinated attack that the Japanese were still planning. The intelligence advantage that had given Japan 8 months of tactical surprise was now working decisively against them, providing their enemies with perfect knowledge of Japanese positions, capabilities, and intentions. Captain Tanaka watched the controlled chaos of aircraft recovery operations with mounting anxiety. Her flight deck was packed with returning bombers, their wings folded as deck crews rushed to clear them for the hangar. Aviation fuel and ammunition were scattered across the deck in patterns that prioritized speed over safety protocols that had been developed through hard experience. "We're completely vulnerable," she confided in her executive officer, Commander Rina Ogawa. "If enemy aircraft appear now, we're sitting targets."
The Japanese had committed their most fundamental error. They had allowed themselves to be caught with aircraft on deck during the most dangerous phase of carrier operations. All 4 carriers were simultaneously recovering aircraft, their decks crowded with planes, fuel, and ordnance. Their combat air patrol had been reduced to minimum levels to accommodate landing operations, leaving inadequate high-altitude protection. At 0915 hours, the last aircraft from the Coral Reef strike touched down on Japanese flight decks. Admiral Hayakawa immediately ordered preparation for a massive counterstrike against the American carriers. 138 aircraft would participate, every available bomber and fighter that could be made ready. It would be the largest carrier strike in Japanese naval history, a coordinated assault designed to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific permanently. But as Japanese deck crews frantically prepared their aircraft for launch, American dive bombers were beginning their final approach from 22,000 feet. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Japanese fleet was about to discover what it felt like to be the victim of the tactical surprise that had made them masters of the Pacific. At 0925 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Rebecca McCluskey spotted the Japanese fleet spread below her like a tactical display in a war college classroom. After becoming temporarily disoriented and nearly running out of fuel, her Enterprise dive bombers had followed the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main formation, a navigation technique that brought them directly to their target. The sight that greeted McCluskey was beyond any American pilot's most optimistic expectations. 4 enemy carriers steaming in perfect formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft being prepared for launch. The Tsukuyomi, Raijin, Susanoo, and Amaterasu represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation, but they were caught at precisely their most vulnerable moment. Fuel lines snaked across their decks like arterial systems. Ordnance was stacked around aircraft being armed for launch. Their combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level by earlier American attacks from Coral Reef, leaving minimal high-altitude protection against the threat now materializing from directly overhead. "Stevens, take the carrier on the left," McCluskey radioed to Lieutenant Sarah Stevens, leader of Scouting Squadron 8.
I'll take the flagship on the right." The American formation split with precision that would have impressed Japanese tacticians. 42 dive bombers positioned themselves for coordinated attacks on the carriers Tsukuyomi and Raijin, while simultaneously, Yorktown's aircraft prepared to assault the Susanoo. Below them, Japanese lookouts were just beginning to spot the incoming threat. Aboard the flagship Tsukuyomi, Admiral Hayakawa was conducting final reviews of her counter-strike plans when air raid alarms began screaming across the ship with desperate urgency. She rushed to the bridge wing just in time to witness American dive bombers rolling into their attacks from directly overhead. The same tactical approach that Japanese pilots had perfected and used to devastating effect for 8 months of Pacific warfare. Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Best led her section of dive bombers into a 70-degree dive toward the Tsukuyomi's flight deck. The massive carrier began a desperate turn to port, but she was too heavily laden with aircraft, fuel, and ammunition to maneuver effectively against aircraft already committed to their attack runs. Best's 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb struck just behind the midship elevator, penetrating through the flight deck and detonating in the hangar spaces where fully fueled aircraft were being prepared for launch. The explosion was catastrophic beyond imagination. Aviation gasoline ignited in a roaring inferno that spread instantly to adjacent aircraft. Ordnance began detonating in secondary explosions that shook the 42,000-ton ship from bow to stern. Within minutes, Japan's most famous aircraft carrier was transformed into a floating crematorium, her flight deck buckled and torn, her hangar deck an inferno that damage control parties could not contain. Simultaneously, Enterprise bombers were attacking the carrier Raijin with equally devastating results. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Dickinson's section scored direct hits on the carrier's island structure and flight deck, while other bombs penetrated to the hangar spaces below. Like her sister ship, Raijin was carrying a full complement of armed and fueled aircraft, creating ideal conditions for the spreading fires that soon made the vessel uninhabitable. The third carrier, Susanoo, fell victim to Yorktown's dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Diana Leslie. Captain Mari Ishida, who had warned about evolving American capabilities in pre-battle intelligence briefings, watched helplessly as her ship was transformed into a blazing wreck in less than 5 minutes of concentrated attack. The speed and violence of the American attack was unprecedented in carrier warfare history. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Japanese naval aviation had dominated Pacific warfare through superior coordination, tactical innovation, and the element of surprise. Now those same advantages were being used against them with surgical precision by an enemy they had consistently underestimated.
Within less than 8 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. Their aircraft destroyed, their crews decimated, their offensive capability eliminated forever. The striking force that had terrorized the Pacific for 8 months was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Only the carrier Amaterasu, operating several miles north of the main formation under Captain Tanaka's command, escaped the initial American onslaught. But the damage was already irreversible. Japan had lost 3/4 of her fleet carrier strength in a battle that was supposed to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific. Captain Reika Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Amaterasu, watching columns of black smoke rise from her burning sister ships on the southern horizon. As the sole surviving carrier commander of what had been the most powerful naval aviation force in history, she faced a situation unprecedented in Japanese military experience: overwhelming defeat at the hands of an enemy they had consistently underestimated. The intelligence warnings that Commander Nakamura had presented for weeks proved prophetic with devastating accuracy. The Americans had indeed possessed detailed knowledge of Japanese capabilities and intentions. They had positioned their forces with mathematical precision, achieving the tactical surprise that had been Japan's trademark for 8 months of Pacific domination. "Launch everything we have," Tanaka ordered her air operations officer, knowing that Amaterasu's survival depended on eliminating American carrier strength before enemy dive bombers could return for another strike. At 10:40 hours, 24 Aichi dive bombers and 8 Zero fighters roared off Amaterasu's flight deck, followed 90 minutes later by 12 Nakajima torpedo bombers with additional fighter escort. Lieutenant Kenji Kobayashi led the first strike toward the reported position of American carriers, his formation flying with the desperate intensity of warriors who understood their empire's fate hung in the balance. Unlike earlier Japanese attacks that had been launched with supreme confidence, this formation flew with the knowledge that they represented Japan's last hope for avoiding complete catastrophe. The intelligence failures that had doomed their fleet at least provided accurate targeting information. American radio transmissions had been intercepted, giving precise coordinates for enemy carrier locations. The American fleet was ready and waiting. Combat air patrol fighters from all 3 carrier task forces had been reinforced and positioned at optimal altitudes based on intelligence about Japanese attack patterns and timing. When Kobayashi's bombers approached Task Force 17 at 11:30 hours, they faced a defensive screen that had been specifically prepared for their arrival. Grumman Wildcat fighters tore into the Japanese formations with devastating effectiveness, their pilots benefiting from months of tactical analysis of Japanese attack methods. Only 9 dive bombers survived the fighter screen, but their pilots were among Japan's most experienced aviators, men who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and every major engagement since. They pressed home their attacks with the same precision that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. 4 bombs struck the carrier Yorktown, causing severe damage to her flight deck and engineering spaces. The veteran carrier, hastily repaired after previous battle damage, began listing as damage control parties fought to contain flooding and fires. But the successful attack on Yorktown represented the death throes of Japanese carrier aviation rather than a resurgent threat. 3 enemy carriers were already sinking, and Amaterasu stood alone against 3 American carrier task forces with overwhelming numerical superiority. The second Japanese strike, launched at 12:45 hours, consisted of 12 obsolete torpedo bombers that should never have been sent against heavily defended enemy carriers. Lieutenant Commander Akira Tonomaga, wounded during the morning Coral Reef attack, led this desperate formation despite injuries that made aircraft control difficult. American fighter pilots intercepted the torpedo bombers 60 miles from their targets, shooting down most of the formation before it could reach attack positions. Only 4 Japanese aircraft survived to launch their torpedoes, achieving minimal results against ships that had been expecting them for hours. The price was the virtual elimination of Amaterasu's remaining strike aircraft and most of her experienced aircrew. Japan's last operational carrier in the Pacific had been reduced to a floating airfield without aircraft, her offensive capability destroyed. At 1500 hours, 36 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found Amaterasu steaming frantically northward in a futile attempt to escape American retribution. Captain Tanaka had managed her ship brilliantly throughout the morning, but she was doomed by the same tactical methods that had destroyed her sister ships. 6 direct hits transformed Japan's last fleet carrier into a blazing wreck, her aviation fuel and ordnance creating the same devastating fires that had consumed Tsukuyomi, Raijin, and Susanoo. Captain Tanaka chose to go down with her ship, sending a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "American carriers attacked us. We are heavily damaged and abandoning ship. Enemy forces remain in area." As evening fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942,
4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or abandoned, their aircraft and experienced crews lost forever. The Battle of Coral Reef was effectively over, decided not by superior American equipment or tactics, but by intelligence advantages that Japanese admirals had refused to acknowledge until it was catastrophically too late.
British Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto received the devastating reports from the battle aboard his flagship Yamato with the stoic composure that had made Japan's most respected naval commander. By midnight, the scope of the disaster was undeniable. 4 fleet carriers sunk, over 3,200 sailors dead, and more than 280 aircraft destroyed, along with their irreplaceable pilots. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood immediately what his subordinate commanders were only beginning to grasp. Japan had lost the Pacific War in a single day. The combined fleet still possessed numerical superiority in battleships and cruisers, but carrier aviation was the decisive weapon of Pacific warfare. Japan's carrier strength had been reduced by 80% in one catastrophic morning, while American industrial capacity would soon begin producing replacement carriers at rates that Japanese shipyards could never match. "Signal all units," Yamamoto ordered his communications officer with characteristic dignity. "Operation Thunderstrike is cancelled. The fleet will withdraw to home waters immediately." The words represented the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific and the beginning of a defensive struggle that could only delay inevitable defeat. Commander Watanabe, Yamamoto's intelligence officer, approached his admiral with decoded American transmissions that had been intercepted during the battle. The implications were staggering and confirmed the worst fears of those who had been warning about American intelligence capabilities for months. The Americans had known the exact timing, location, and composition of Japanese forces. They had positioned their carriers with mathematical precision based on complete knowledge of Japanese operational plans. Enemy pilots had been vectored directly to Japanese carrier positions without conducting time-consuming searches. "Admiral," Watanabe said carefully, "these intercepts confirm that the Americans penetrated our naval codes completely. They knew we were coming, when we would arrive, and exactly how we planned to attack." Yamamoto studied the intercepted transmissions with growing horror. This wasn't coincidence or tactical brilliance, it was intelligence warfare at its most sophisticated level. Japan had been fighting blind, while America possessed perfect vision of enemy intentions and capabilities. The realization struck like a physical blow. Every strategic plan, every operational decision, every tactical movement had been anticipated and countered by an enemy that could read Japanese thoughts as easily as their own operational orders. The Battle of Coral Reef marked more than a tactical defeat. It represented the moment when American intelligence superiority transformed the Pacific conflict from defensive desperation to coordinated offensive campaign based on complete knowledge of enemy capabilities and limitations. Japan would continue fighting for 3 more years, but they would do so as the hunted rather than the hunters, their every move anticipated and countered by an enemy that possessed the most powerful weapon in modern warfare: perfect intelligence about enemy intentions and capabilities. Admiral Hayakawa's final assessment, transmitted before her flagship sank, was characteristically direct. "We lost the moment we stopped listening to our own intelligence officers." The critical intelligence that Japanese commanders had dismissed in May became the foundation of their defeat in June, proving that in naval warfare, as in life, the most dangerous enemy is often the truth we refuse to acknowledge. The morning sun had risen over the Pacific, promising victory for Japan's most powerful fleet. It set over the wreckage of an empire that had chosen institutional blindness over uncomfortable reality, sealing the fate of a war that would drag on for 3 more years, but whose outcome had been determined in 8 minutes of devastating American attack based on intelligence that Japanese admirals had fatally chosen to ignore.